when I served as a parish pastor, at nearly every church, someone would come up to me after preaching and caution me not to be too political in the pulpit. In some churches, that advice was given more emphatically than others. So I want to use the book of Exodus to demonstrate that a preacher cannot do that. A preacher cannot avoid being political. You would have to cut out most of the Bible in order to avoid talking about politics. So, just want to start, not in Exodus, but in Genesis. A key verse for the entire Old Testament is Genesis 12, verse 3. This is God talking to Abram, who has not yet become Abraham. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. A lot of things come up in the book of Exodus that raise the question of, does God love all people or just the people of Israel? And that verse in Genesis reminds us that God's purpose in Israel was not Israel as an end in itself, but Israel as a blessing to all the families of the earth. And as we get into Exodus, we will see how we have to take that verse as a foundation for everything in the Old Testament. Because, well, I'm guessing you know some of what's coming up in the book of Exodus. So, as just a quick refresher course of how the people of Israel got into Egypt, God called Abraham, told him to go to Canaan, which he did. And as soon as he got there, there was a famine. So just because things aren't going well doesn't mean that we're not doing God's will. So we end up through Isaac and Jacob with Joseph. Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery to Egypt. There is a long famine in all of the land. Joseph, because of his ability to interpret dreams, knows to stockpile food. So everybody comes to Egypt for food because that's where the food is. That's where the people of Israel end up in Egypt. So originally, Egypt was a place of safety, security, life, refuge. And for generations, the people of Israel existed very well in the land of Egypt. Everything went well. They got along. Then we come to a decisive verse in the book of Exodus, the point where everything changes. Chapter 1, verse 8. Now a new king rose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. So obviously he could not have known Joseph personally, but he didn't do his history. He did not know the history of the amicable relationships between the people of Israel and the people of Egypt. It says just before that the people of Israel were thriving. Verse 7, but the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So this new king said to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. This new king feels threatened by the people of Israel because they have grown so numerous. And he doesn't trust them. When you read the first 5 books of the Old Testament, one of the issues is the issue of trust. Who trusts whom? And the good guys, the people of Israel, often do not trust people who end up being trustworthy. The people of Israel themselves end up not being trustworthy, and they don't trust people who actually are trustworthy. Now it's the king in Egypt, the Pharaoh in Egypt, who doesn't trust the people of Israel. So he enslaves the people. Now, the slavery was not a sense of that they were owned, that they were property. The rural poor were not slaves in the sense of being the private property of the rich to be bought and sold at will, but they owed their labor to the state when the state demanded it. Technically, the state was proprietor of all lands and collected a part of the harvest as tribute or land rent. Nevertheless, the farmers continued to live on these lands and left them only when the king had need of them. So they were enslaved in the sense that a lot of their freedoms were taken away. Now, it's ironic that Pharaoh says, let us deal shrewdly with them. That's a word in Hebrew that evokes a sense both of wisdom and of craftiness. But everything he does backfires. The story about the midwives. The midwives are able to outsmart him. And when he tries to suppress the people of Israel, they simply have more children. They keep growing strong. So the Pharaoh is not at all able to deal shrewdly with the people. The things he does ends up backfiring. They cause more problems than they solve. An important verse comes up in chapter 2. This is chapter 2, verse 23. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. That's from the NRSV. What the Hebrew said, the Hebrew is enigmatic. It says that God looked on the people, the suffering of the people of Israel, and God knew. It doesn't say what God knew. It just said God looked on their suffering, and God knew. We could leave that just simply the way it is. Now, a lot of people try to fill it in, put something in there. What did God know? They'll try to add something to it. But that God heard their suffering and God knew. So part of the Exodus event is God responding to the suffering of the people, God caring about what they're going through, and God acting to free them. Okay, so we know what happens next. Moses is at the burning bush. God calls Moses and says, go to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh to let my people go. Moses refuses. He tries to talk God out of it, makes every excuse in the world. I'm not a good speaker. Moses has gained a reputation as a stutterer. It doesn't really say that he stutters. He just says he's not a good speaker. Now, the irony of that, of course, is that later on in the book of Exodus, he makes very impassioned speeches. Finally, Moses just simply says, send somebody else. He just doesn't want to do it. He's actually comfortable where he is. He has a job. He has a wife. He's away from Egypt, where they're chasing him down, where he's a wanted man. He wants to stay where he is, where he's comfortable. God calls him, gives him a mission. we know about the plagues. The plagues demonstrate God's control over nature. It is a reminder to the reader, the original reader, and to us today, that God is a powerful God. It's a reminder of God as a powerful God. We often hear about God who cares about us, who loves us, but also a powerful God. So it's the God in chapter 2 who heard the people's groaning. God knew, God understood what they were going through, and then also a powerful God, God of love, God of power. Exodus affirms that. Now, we're running into very dark territory. We get into chapter 12. This is the last of the plagues. Chapter 12 is the initial Passover. They are to prepare a lamb. They are to paint blood on their doorposts. Chapter 12, verse 13, the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall strike you when I strike the land of Egypt. So we know the horrible scene that comes next, verse 29. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all his officials and all the Egyptians, and there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. God has said all along, starting in chapter 4, that only after the death of the firstborn would Pharaoh relent and let the people go. That is one of the mysteries of the book of Exodus. Why would God kill the firstborn of all the Egyptians? We can call the Egyptians the oppressors, the slaveholders, but why take it out on the most vulnerable people among them? Again, this is one of the times where I have to go back to chapter 12 of Genesis, that Israel's ultimate purpose is the blessing of all the families of the earth. So underlying everything is that promise that the purpose of the people of Israel is to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. That does not solve all of the problems. It does not take away the pain of the Egyptians. It does not make us all comfortable with what happened. It does not take away the shock and the horror of the death of the firstborn, but it is a counterbalancing idea that God's ultimate purpose is the blessing of all people. All right, so in scenes that were dramatized by Cecil B. DeMille, Moses holds out his hand with the staff in it, and the waters part, and the people pass through the Sea of Reeds, sometimes also translated as the Red Sea. As soon as they get through and the Egyptians come through, the waters come back and drown them all. Now, one of the debates in Old Testament studies is there any historical core to what we find in the book of Exodus? Was there an actual Exodus event? The Exodus is considered throughout the Old Testament as the defining event in Israel's history. This is how God formed you as a community. This is why God has a claim on you. Question is, was there anything, did anything actually happen that could be a historical core for the Exodus event? One argument, you may know that the books of the Pentateuch are composite books. They were written by different people and then edited together in the time of the Exodus, the Babylonian, not the Exodus, the Babylonian exile. So a variety of authors provided these stories, edited together. You have two prose narratives, one earlier, one later, that describe the Exodus, the events of the Exodus. You have two poems that come up in Exodus 15. One is a very long poem where the people recount what happened. Then a much shorter poem in chapter 15, verse 21. And Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." One of the things that Stephen said was that I might talk about the development of the Hebrew language. What we have in Exodus 15, the first poem that we encounter, is likely one of the oldest things in the Hebrew Bible. It is a very old poem, and you can tell it is because in the Hebrew it's written in an archaic style that you don't find anywhere else in the Old Testament. So you have this very old poem that describes the Exodus event. You have this much shorter poem, the Song of Miriam, and you have two prose accounts. So, four sources that attest that something happened, some kind of escape from Egypt. I do not believe that what the book of Exodus gives us is accurate history that is the kind that we would write, that we would expect a historian to write today. It is a book of faith. It is a book trying to convince the Hebrew people, the people of Israel, and then later the Judeans, people in Judah in the Babylonian exile, that God is for them. God has chosen them, and God has a purpose for them. But you have these four ancient sources, one of which is the oldest thing in the Old Testament, attesting that something happened in the Exodus event. The way the Exodus event is described, I think it's like 600,000 men. And if you add women and children in, it would be somewhere around 2 million people who escaped from Egypt. That seems unlikely historically, that you could get 2 million people all going in the same direction, all able to hear you and follow the directions and all like that, that many people could escape from Egypt without there being some historical record of it. What some theologians think, what some Old Testament scholars think, is that 2 million was the population of Jerusalem at the time it was written, at the time that it was edited, as a way of saying, it's a mental note to the people, you are the ones who escaped from Egypt. This is your story. So having 2 million people leave, who maybe the population of Jerusalem at the time, was a way of saying, this is your story. You are in this. So, as I say, you know what happens. The people of Judah, the people of Israel, the Hebrews, escape from the Egyptians through the Sea of Reeds. The water comes back, drowns the Egyptians. They go through some harrowing experiences where they don't have food, they don't have water. Moses is able to get them food and water. In chapter 19, very important verse for Israel's identity. This is chapter 19, starting in verse 4. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, You shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. This again is similar to what God tells Abram in Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis chapter 12, God tells Abram, your people shall be a blessing to all the families of the earth. When God here in this passage tells the people, you are a kingdom of priests. A priest, of course, was an intermediary between God and the people. They are a kingdom of priests, meaning they are a liaison, an intermediary between God and all the rest of the world. Their job is to be this kingdom of priests. The book of 1 Peter picks up on this and addresses the church the same way. Kingdom of priests. The book of Exodus makes two affirmations about the Exodus event. Now, I said there may be some historical core, but we can't recover it. We have no access to it. Did a small group escape from Egypt? And then this got embellished and recorded, and poems and songs were written about it. We simply don't know. But at least these narratives and these poems became part of their identity, part of the identity of the Hebrew people, the Israelites, then later on the Judeans, southern kingdom, which was taken into exile in the 6th century. And part of the reason why the Old Testament was written and edited and collected, I mean, it was written before that, but that it was collected and edited was to enable the people to salvage their identity in this time of exile. Everything was destroyed. The temple was destroyed. They were carried off into exile. And the very existence of Israel as a people, of Judah as a people, was threatened. So these stories, these narratives, these poems were a part of the way that they maintained their identity. So two affirmations about the Exodus event from the book of Exodus. The first is that God chose them as a people. God chose them as a kingdom of priests. That was their identity. They were to be the mediator between God and everybody else on the planet. They were to be God's priests to everybody else. One affirmation. Second affirmation is that God freed the people from political and social oppression. It mattered to God that they were suffering under political and social oppression. Their circumstances in life mattered. There are problems with the book of Exodus. The death of the Egyptian firstborn. As I said, why would God punish the most vulnerable, even among the oppressors? I know of no really good answer to that. We can talk about it. We can talk around it. It was the only way God could get the people out of Egypt to form them as this kingdom of priests. At least within the narrative world, that was the only way to do it. It is still a difficult, sobering story. Part of the reason for the writing or the final editing of the book of Exodus was to give the people in exile a sense of identity. So saying that the firstborn had to die was a way of saying, look what God did to form you as a people. It doesn't solve all the problems. It doesn't make it all go away. It doesn't tie it up in a nice, neat little bow and say, here's your answer. Another problem with the book of Exodus, the time in the wilderness brought its own problems. They were hungry, they were thirsty, they fought wars, they existed on the same kind of food every day, they didn't know when they were going to get there, there were internal struggles, and every now and then they wanted to go back they hated Egypt at first and they wanted to get out. And they rejoiced when they got out. They sang in chapter 15. They sang a hymn. They had a worship service, but they wanted to go back. We know that the people of Israel, once they got out of Egypt and they were in the wilderness, they built the golden calf. The whole point of the wilderness experience was to form them into the people that they were supposed to be. We tend to think of the wilderness experience as like a grief experience or a pastoral care issue. The time in the wilderness was really spiritual formation. The time in the wilderness was to enable them to become the people they were supposed to be. But they constantly rebelled. They wouldn't listen. The book of Numbers, God decides, I'm done with you. I'm going to start over with the next generation. So there are problems with the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus makes the affirmation that God cared about their suffering, cared about their political and social situation. But it's not a nice, neat story. They go out in the wilderness and they refuse to become the people they were supposed to be. They fight wars. They're hungry. And then once they get to the promised land, once they finish their time in the wilderness, they slaughter the Canaanites who were there, all of the peoples who were there in the promised land. I do not know of a way to take that problem away, just completely solve it. But I keep going back to Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. You're to bless all the families of the earth. And then the promise in chapter 19, you will be to me a kingdom of priests. Those are the underlying affirmations of the book of Exodus, that God formed the people to be a kingdom of priests, to be a mediator between God and all the rest of the world. Also, the affirmation that God cared about their suffering, God cared about their political situation. God acted to bring them into freedom. So I can't solve all the problems, but I can make those affirmations. God cared about their suffering, brought them political freedom. So Exodus teaches us that God cares about political situations. Their suffering was political. They were suffering because of where they were and who was in power over them. Pharaoh, who didn't trust them, who was suspicious, who was a control freak, was in power over them, and God cared about that. So the message of the Bible is not just about what's inside of us. It's not just our own internal workings and our own internal one-to-one relationship with God. God cares about political situations. So it's not just about our devotional life. It's not just about our own personal sins, our own personal relationship with God. It's about our political situation. God cares about that. Contemporary readers can enumerate a long list of situations that limit freedom. Some countries in the world continue to practice actual slavery. Governments limit freedom of expression and religious practice. Poverty, economic exploitation, and racism trap people in conditions that restrict their ability to thrive and flourish. In addition to these political limits on freedom, such things as addictions, physical disabilities, psychological damage, domestic violence, and even low self-esteem can seem as much a trap as Pharaoh's brickmaking. Defining limitation proves much easier than defining true freedom. A clear understanding of freedom proves elusive. One who enjoys relative economic and political freedom might find internal psychological forces that limit the enjoyment of prosperity. One thinks of Howard Hughes, a wealthy man who suffered from phobias. Popular culture contains numerous examples of athletes and entertainers who find career and financial freedom, but wreck their lives with personal indulgences. Success can lead to the trap of pressure to remain successful. One has trouble deriving a clear, precise definition of pure freedom, if such a state of mind, politics, and physical health exists. Right. Our concern with accuracy and with resources, with using sources, and is really an enlightenment idea. And in the ancient world, you wrote in a way to persuade people. They didn't see themselves as lying or being deceptive. They saw themselves as writing something that would have an effect. There was a man in my church who led a study on a book written by an Old Testament scholar who tried to find the historical core. We don't even know when the setting of the book of Exodus is. There were times, large swaths of time, where what we now call Palestine was part of the Egyptian Empire. So we don't. I am skeptical that we can recover an historical core. The fact that we have 4 sources that attest to it does not prove that there is an historical core. It suggests it. And whatever actually did happen, yeah, got embellished and retold. No, they're not interchangeable. You're right. They're 2 different bodies of water, but it often gets translated as the Red Sea, even though the words Yam Suf means Sea of Reeds. So in Hebrew, it really does say the Sea of Reeds. And the only reason I brought up Red Sea is that's usually the way it's translated, even though you're exactly right. And the Tulsa was really just sort of, well, both of them were just a slaughter. The Holocaust shows us the depth of human depravity. The Jewish people in Europe were targeted for no particular reason. And I've read that there were worse atrocities in Africa than, well, worse at least in terms of higher numbers. I saw a Facebook meme about that there was a man who killed 15 million Africans. And we attribute, of course, 10 million to Hitler and the Nazis. That is, of course, evidence that a political situation can cause unbearable suffering. And we could talk about it at length. You asked about the Tulsa, and this was just everything about it was just a horrifying atrocity. Don't even know exactly how many people were killed, but estimates of 300 people were killed. It's come back to our consciousness because it happened 100 years ago. It has not been entirely erased from history, but it's been downplayed. And I saw on Facebook, some of my friends on Facebook said they grew up in Oklahoma and was never taught in the schools. And they didn't know about it until they were adults, even though they grew up in Oklahoma. So it has been covered up. It caused untold suffering, and the suffering lasted for generations. It wasn't over as soon as it was over. So the book of Exodus would say God cares about those kinds of situations. It matters to God that people go through that. When I was a pastor, I told my people, we're better off understanding the Bible as a collection of literature than as history, science, or journalism. The writers were not trying to give us a journalistic interpretation of what happened. A journalist wants to know who, what, where, when, and try to get the facts straight. The biblical writers were creating narratives and poems and literature to inspire faith. So, although it is worthwhile to explore the question of what the history might have been, the biblical writers give us material that we can use to reconstruct some history. But in my judgment, we are better off looking at the Bible as faith language, as literature, as creative attempts to describe how God acts and what God expects of us.